and all that. Yeah. And then on the environmental side, ECCC, so Environment Climate Change Canada, they're kind of leading the scientific advice, environmental stuff. But into that, Fisheries and Ocean goes around, feeds into scientific advice. A really big one are the First Nation, which have a lot of that critical knowledge. They know their traditional territories best, plus they have specific uses and priorities in the area, which is drives a lot of the spill response prioritization. We have the province involved there. Then Western Canada Marine Response Organization. I'm sure you've seen those. They're ever more orange, blue, and white boats all over the coast, this is funded through the spill response regime, because vessels over a certain size have to pay into an insurance, and that insurance then funds WCMRC. And then the polluter itself, often represented by WCMRC or other contractors, is also part of the spill response, because if everything goes to plan, they're paying the bills, so they need to be part of it all. So just going to the next one, just also quickly as a good background, it's kind of, when you think about spill response and everything related to it, it's a good idea to think about the phases. So there's a planning preparedness, which is basically the a priori things. We really want to get your ducks in a row. Exercising, training, plans, procedures, yada, yada, yada. Response, obviously, when something happens, then you better have your things organized. You want to be coordinated, transparent. You want to support and work with the other response partners. And then once the boat's off the water, like the immediate response action is gone, you're in the recovery part, which is now it's around, what are the impacts to fisheries? Is it safe to eat the clams? There should be a lessons learned kind of continuous improvement component there as well. And I'm going to talk in my talk largely about the first and the second part, just because I have already 55 slides, which is way too much. So I just skip past the last one. That's just another complex component. So and I don't want to bore people too much around with planning. There's a bunch of plans in place. We have different levels. There's national plans. We have board plans with the US, North and South, in BC and other areas as well. We have regional plans. Then we have those error response plans, and finally geographic response strategies. I'm going to walk you through some examples there. So error response plan, the BC coastline is divided into 8 sections. And 4 of those plans, which were developed in collaboration with Coast Guard, First Nations, Environment Climate Change Canada, the province, DFO, yes, and the Response Corporation, they are published. I mean, continues to improve them and use them and everything else, but at least the basic plans are published on the WAVES library. So that's kind of for one of these little polygons you see there, and that's certainly helpful to have those. But then there's even like the planning where WCMRC and nations, they develop geographic response strategy, which is actually looking at an area and like, okay, this particular mud flat is really important. Oil would stick around a long time. Okay, where do we put the boom? Where do we put the anchors? How much boom do we need? And all the good stuff. So really, really detailed one. So that's the kind of highest level of highest resolution of planning that happens. And it happens more. There's more and more of these ones out there and available, which do help a lot during spills, because obviously it helps with planning and logistics and all the good stuff. So now kind of switching over to kind of the science DFO tools that feed into spill response. And a really big one there, which also can be used for other things, is the vulnerability framework that DFO has put together a few years back. And we just went through revising it, where we basically looked at, or colleagues of mine, at all the marine species under DFO mandates. So that's everything except marine birds. So from algae to whales, kind of try to group them by how would they get exposed to spills, and then looking what the concerns are: exposure, sensitivity, and recovery. And yeah, the updates have been published. There's some more detailed Canadian Science Advisory reports around different oil types, which is just going through the final reviews and revision, and will also get published soon. So sounds a bit abstract, but this is basically one of the beauty of the process is simplicity. So it's really pretty transparent. So this is just an example of one of the scorings for intertidal clams. And basically you look at the 4 different exposure criteria. So do they aggregate? What's the mobility? Do they interact with the sea surface or with the sea floor? It's either yes or no, so 0, 1. Then 2 sensitivity criteria, mechanical sensitivity or chemical sensitivity. Again, it's a 0 or 1. And then 4, recovery, meaning, so the first one is how likely are things to get oiled. Second, if they get oiled, how bad is it? And then third is basically, okay, now they got hit, how quickly can they recover? And again, there's obviously population status, reproduction capacity, are they only one spot? And are they in this unconsolidated substrates which can entrap oil? You just add them together, so it's a score out of 10, and everything above a 7 is basically high risk. And the really cool thing about that risk is around the vulnerability framework is like there's all the details there for people like me as an environmental incident coordinator. In a spill, there's a question comes up around, I mean, this is transient killer whales, but could be eelgrass or clams or something. There's all the rationale there and all the references, so you can really dig down really fast. So it's a very great reference thing. And another really cool thing we've done out of this recently is visual, like infographics. So for the mammals, you can just go through and look very quickly how sensitive things are. And that's a multi-page document for all these different groups. It's sorted by groups and then by priority. And it's a really handy tool to just, and we started doing more of the infographics to make stuff more accessible. And I'm super happy with those. Find them very useful myself. Another thing we're doing, because question comes up, you know, species X in this area, species Y in this area, is more and more species distribution modeling, because for some species, you just can't model them. You can't, like, you know, the sampling just doesn't work. So we need to do some sampling and then do predictive modeling to see where they are, which is kind of the second best thing we can have to look where they are. And we've done 12 species and more species are coming. The other thing, and this is really something that's, I think gets more and more widely used, the shore zone. It's this shoreline imagery, aerial imagery, which happened in the province in the 90s. And now it's in the process of being redone in the last few years. And it's not us. I mean, there's a lot of other agencies and nations that are also starting contributing, and it's publicly available, but that's flying the shoreline at a really low tide in the summer. And then, so that's a visual imagery, continuous visual imagery, but then also developing GIS tools out of this. So any coastal mapping, coastal management, this is really useful. And we continue to add to that as well, because for spills is also very useful. It's very useful to know what the shoreline is like, hard substrate, soft substrate, all the good stuff. Then also the other thing we've done a lot are fact sheets for all those species which are in the highly vulnerable kind of level there. And it's really around quick summaries for the species, a little bit on ID, obviously how big a concern they are, but then also kind of where do you find them in the seasonality, because the problem is in a spill, yes, you might have a GS layer, or someone has a layer with, okay, this is where sea otters are, or this is where, you know, some other species is. But then the question is, yeah, but for this time of the year, are they going to be here, or are they now at this time of the year more vulnerable than something else? And then that's where this helps us to look at, you know, yes, they have pups right now, or well, they're probably not using the breeding rookeries right now if it's sea lions and so forth. So it helps with that. And the problem just is because as an environmental incident coordinator, you deal with a whole breadth of species in the province. So obviously you can't know everything about everything. So it's very useful tool. Plus we share those as well with nations and Coast Guard and so forth as kind of a reference material as well. The other thing, and that's not non-shareable yet, but it's getting there, is also just more infographics around how different environments are impacted by oil, because again, it's a good quick reference guide to explain people what we are thinking. So rather than me waffling on for a long time explaining why we think the mud flat and blah, 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 we just have an infographic and quickly walk people through. Plus having it all in one place helps you not to forget things, because spills are pretty stressful events, and it's very easy if you don't have lists and checklists and procedures to forget something. It's human nature. Something else is really an internal one, but it's just additional tools where we really summarize species information around herring and invertebrates, intertidal invertebrates, looking so that we can go into more detail for certain areas, you know, in this particular bay, what's the herring spawn like, or here, you know, northern abalone, when is there spawning, when it would be a particular concern versus still a concern, but maybe a little bit lower on the line. So those are all tools, and we're working on getting it more digitized and more coherent combined with GIS, which is kind of a project that's kind of ticking in the background, but really kind of having a really useful tool to gather information as quickly as possible, because you see in a later slide, time is pretty important actually in those scenarios. So next one, I'll just want to talk a little bit of response. So I'm going to couple of slides around just how it generally works, and then I'm going to use an example of an ongoing spill, which is moving a bit slower than a lot of spills, but it's still, I think there's some good stuff in there. So what happens first? Obviously, it's oil in the water. Coast Guard notifies. They notify us, but a lot of other local government, First Nations as well, and they issue those pollution reports. And if you ever reported a spill, and feel free to report spills. It's always good to report them. When you call the 1-800 number from Coast Guard, you call the Regional Operations Center, and they then issue a pollution report, no matter what. And then there's a follow-up by the duty officer to determine how bad it is. So never hurts calling them. They're never upset. They're always nice and friendly. I've reported a bunch myself. They also take reports of derelict vessels as well, which probably all of you have somewhere in the front yard sitting on the beach. And then if a spill happens, in Canada, we use the incident command system, which is really something that's used globally pretty much. It's like this, it was developed for emergencies where cross-agency response is required for natural or human-made disaster. It really became, after 9/11, it became a really big thing in the US, where government agencies just get funding if they use ICS. So, and it's the idea is to have the scalable structure. So an incident command system, an incident command post can be one guy in a truck or a woman, or could be Deepwater Horizon with 20,000 people involved. The incident command structure allows for that. And there's not a lot of things where a lot of people know it and can use it that way. And the way it's used in spills here is there's the unified command, which we're going to talk about in a second, and there's the communication is there, and a lot of other things in there as well, which really help. One really big one, which a lot of people often struggle, is that if you go to into an incident command system or incident command post and you work there, you don't work for your agency anymore. You're part of the incident. So it's a bit of a mind bender in the beginning, but it makes a lot of sense when you're in the middle of it, because it makes things much more efficient. And the one thing, I don't want to bore you to death with that, but the one thing that's really kind of noteworthy is that the way Coast Guard is using it out here is unified command, which means if you look at that green box there, is so it's not Coast Guard is in command, but Coast Guard is part of unified command. So emergency management, BC, or the BC MOE normally is another unified commander. Responsible party is a incident commander. First Nations are there as well, and if it's near a local, if there's an area where local governments are active, then them as well. So it's unified command, joint command, which make joint decision, joint sign off on action plans and activities, operations. So that's really important. And then the other things that are going on really important, there's a joint information management, that not different information goes out from different people and confuses the public. And really the critical part there is on the planning section, you see the environmental unit. That's where I always hang out. And you'll find a lot of those environmental technical specialists there, which develops a lot of plans and strategies, which then feed over to the operations section, where Canadian Coast Guard and/or Western Canada Marine Response Corporation do the actual on-water operations. So that's kind of how that translates. So just using an example here, how does this work? So this is an example. It applies. This was because sometimes we have older regs, the polluter pay regime, so the kind of shipping act doesn't apply anymore, because it only 2 years after the sinking it applies, and we have one older one and one new incident where it's old regs, so there's no polluter pay anymore, so it's all government led. So the unified command is Canadian Coast Guard, First Nation, BC Ministry of Environment, because there's no local municipality in both scenarios. And then, especially in the environmental unit, you have First Nation, BC Parks, if there's a park, and or maybe BC Wildfire Service, because they have a lot of incident command experience, Environment Climate Change Canada, including the Canadian Wildlife Service to bring the bird information to it, and then obviously Fisheries and Oceans Canada is involved as well. And then just really don't want to take it too far, but the really important thing is this is kind of the way the planning works. And the timelines are pretty critical. So if it's an actual incident and it's a bad one, then, you know, at 8 a.m. you figure out the initial tasking, or you get told the initial tasking, that's what we need. These are the plans we need. This is the prioritization we need. And but about at 12 o'clock, you need to have a plan together, a preliminary, and then you get feedback. And then by 2 o'clock, you kind of have to have it done. So that's why we develop so many tools to have better data availability, because it's not a lot of time. And then the other thing that's really important is that you always plan for the next day. So on the left is kind of the planning, environmental unit stuff where we at. But if you don't get the feedback of the field information in time, if you get at the end of the day, feedback from the field, your plan A was useless, you couldn't involve it in your plan for the next day. So the next day, the ops people still might end up doing something useless. So that's where we're also working on tools, and I'm talking about them too much, but how we can get the field information as quickly as possible. That kind of is more real time, that we can adjust the plan and adjust to changing situation in time to have the next day's plan set up better. So that's another fun one to work on. And then the environment unit, I mentioned a lot of these decisions are made. I mentioned the partners, always First Nation. Without First Nation, we can't really operate. Yeah. And sometimes we go a bit loopy and start sticking weird stuff on the door on the right-hand side. There was big bar after a few months, so people lost it slowly. And then there's a lot of things that the environment unit is responsible for. And this, I don't want to go through a list in great detail, but there's a lot of important things. I will talk a little bit about resource at risk. Wildlife management, obviously, is pretty important. Waste management, which sounds really boring, but it's actually really important, even when it's boring. So that's a really critical one. Sampling, obviously, boring stuff like permits are important as well. Fisheries closure is a big one for us, for DFO. And then, yeah, other things around operations and other things. And there's one thing I just want to talk a little bit more is those resources at risk. And because every ICS form has a number, it has a number, it's 232. So this is one really important one where we work with the nations, with the partners to pull together. Okay, we think this is how far the oil is going to go in the next 24 hours. So where are we going to tell Coast Guard to put up the booms? Obviously, the first boom normally goes around the casualty, the vessel. And obviously, if there's search and rescue, that's all takes priority. But let's say the vessel is boomed or gone, and now the oil is loose. Where do we go? This is when we sit around, map, and start talking about priorities and where do we want to go? What do we want to do? And it's hard discussions, but we really combine all the environmental stuff, cultural, archaeological concerns that comes from the nations, socioeconomic might also play into it, and then we draw circles on the map, and then we do the prioritization, which is pretty interesting. Here's an example from one of the spills where, yes, we always manage to come up with a list, but it's hard. We try to be, it's all what do you say, collaborative, compromise based, and we just decide what's the concern is. The other thing we also do is we are very clear to the nations saying, you know, you don't have to tell us why this area is important. We can just put in First Nations activities, and that's all we need to hear. And then when it comes to prioritization, you just tell me, you know, out of the 3 or 4 you have concerns, is this the most important or the second most important? Again, because we want to be careful around and respectful of First Nation, you know, information. It's theirs, and they can share it if they choose to. And if not, we just put that in. That's all we need. But you can imagine it's not an easy process sometimes. But with nation participation, all the partners there, and then again, the sign-off through Unified Command, where you also have nation participation, there's several checkpoints where we can make sure that it's you know, local nations are happy with the result. And we have received a lot of positive feedback in the recent time on spills. Yeah, and then there's a lot of monitoring going on. This was from one of the most complicated spills, and I probably don't want to go into too much detail, just there's lots going on. I kind of want to drill a little bit now into an example of kind of a slow spill, but it's the biggest one I'm dealing with right now, is the USAT, so U.S. Army Transport Brigadier General, actually it's M.G. Selinsky, which sank in 1946 in Granville Channel. I'll show you a map on the next slide. And it was loaded with some car parts and some ordnance, just to keep it exciting. And it was full of fuel, which is the important thing to realize. Like, a lot of those high-risk wrecks we have, and we have a list, it's not tankers, it's just big ships which have big tanks with fuel. And when they go down, some of it goes, some of it stays, and then eventually it goes out. So sank with an unknown amount of fuel on board. There was a spill at the time, and the nation stopped using, after that, certain beaches, and they're still not using them. But there was no record of it. It was 1946, it was wartime, and just after the war, and it's just nobody cared. And now it's sitting upside down about 40 meters on the side of Granville Channel. So what is in bottom left is a side scan sonar of the vessels upside down, turned turtle, and the tanks are leaking slowly fuel oil. The wreck is basically decaying. Just for the occasion, Granville Channel is part of that inside passage. So if you ever take the ferry from Prince Rupert to Port Hardy, it's right here in the channel. The location of the sinking is pretty much the narrowest point, less than 500 meters wide, which means there's huge currents running. So currents run often over 7 knots. If you're out there, I've been there twice now in the field. At times you think you're standing on the edge of a river, not a piece of ocean. The vessel has been pumped three times in the last 15 years to get the oil out, but there's still some there, and it started leaking again in fall 2022. So because again, it's an old wreck, it's in bad shape, so you can pump it, but there might be still some left, because you're not pumping the tanks, you're just emptying the empty spaces, and the tanks might be somewhere else. So it's a problem. The other thing is, it's a very remote location. Hartley Bay is the closest community, which is very small, I don't know, 200 people maybe. And the weather is pretty wild as well. I mean, Coast Guard was there with an RV, and they had 80-knot winds whipping on the channel, and we've seen some pretty crazy gusts. So it's a pretty interesting environment. So part of every spill is, how much oil is there, how much oil is coming up, where is it going, and all this stuff. And we have a number of tools. We have trajectory modeling. We use drifter buoys, so sponge pops you see in the middle there. Obviously, you have the red -8 from Transport Canada, which can do overflight. But the problem is those remote areas is, especially, it's not bad enough that there's a constant people out on the water. Even if you get the NASP, the National Aerial Surveillance Plane task, it can only go over like once every day or 2 days, and you get a 5-minute snapshot, which is really hard to get long-term trends. So we started messing around with these field cameras, and so we went up in first week of January to install a camera in the tree, and we got to go on one of the Coast Guard's emergency tow vehicles, which coincidentally still had the cable from where it towed that container ship off Victoria in December, and the tow line snapped, which I found very interesting, very exciting to see a tow line that thick laying on deck, which just snapped the week before. It's a scary scenario, but anyway. So what we do, we put up these cameras in trees, or in a tree, with the idea to get what consistent point of view, looking down on the sheen, consistent imagery, independent from weather or anything else. The camera takes a picture and sends it over satellite to us. We can remotely set time, blah, blah, blah. It worked really well in another incident, and we put one up there. And what we're seeing is really good imagery, consistent every 15 minutes, rain or shine, that thing sends us a picture. And we are basically scoring those images based on just how likely is it that we saw oil there. And obviously all these ones, to be honest, 3 of them are pretty bad ones. It's about as bad as it gets. But the one on the bottom left you see is a bit of a lighter one, but still we would score all of those high confidence there's oil there, just because the image and everything else is really hard to quantify it, but the confidence we see oil, that's something we're pretty tight on. I also want to mention, you just look at 14,000 pictures and you see a nice whale blow in the background, so that's worth it right there. And we also saw these birds flying through, which are apparently trumpeter swans. My colleagues of Canadian Wildlife Service are pretty sure of. So these are the like I say, you look at 14,000 pictures and you see lots of wildlife. It's basically a safari camera, I call it. So back to serious. So this is our camera in the tree, and this is kind of the analysis we can do from the pictures, which is pretty neat. So it's really the red ones are the percentage of pictures of the usable pictures, which with high confidence, high medium confidence have oil. The orange is low, and you see how it got worse and worse. And then in July, the Coast Guard went out. There was a contractor, and they did an assessment of where the oil is in the wreck. They also did a lot of patching. And we've seen it since, fortunately, going down. I mean, it's still not great, but at least it's bought us a little bit of time. And we also do the analysis day by day, and this is just this month. I guess I haven't pulled down the last few pictures, but you see there's a really quiet period right now, so maybe something's getting better. We don't know. We have to see how it continues. Obviously, tides, windows, and everything else influences as well how much we see when. Yeah, and they just see the camera up in the tree, and the tree climbers. We have commercial tree climbers with us. They have to unfortunately chop off the top and all sorts of things, but it's working really well. Like I say, it's just out there taking a picture every 15 minutes. It's beautiful. 1 second. And then I mentioned trajectory models, because obviously really important for the planning. We do specific preparedness planning for this thing right now because it's been going for a while, and we know the risk is not going to be mitigated for a while. But the big one is, if something happens, how far would the oil go? And while we have a lot of great oceanographers and we have trajectory models, you can imagine that a channel which is, I'm guessing now, 50 kilometers long and at the narrowest point 500 meters wide, with open ocean on both ends and other fjords feeding in, that most trajectory models struggle with that scenario. So a big one we always use is drifters now, those SpongeBobs they're called, because they have a massive sponge in them. And they have a GPS tracker. We deploy them whenever we can. And it just gives us some real-time data we can then give to the modelers for them to validate and tweak their models. We've also staged some at the Canadian Coast Guard in Prince Rupert, and I've offered the GitGut Nation also some to stage in Hartley Bay. I hope they take me up on that offer, because they would be very useful, and they're very accessible. Like, it's easily set up that whoever launches them can watch the data, and everything else they don't need me. So that's ideal. The other thing we learned with spills and trajectories is that obviously trajectories, I mean, they use the tides and all this good stuff, but also the weather. In a lot of places on our coast, the nearest weather station might be, and for Granville Channel, the nearest weather station is actually in Douglas Channel, which is a very, very different weather system, totally different outflow. So I have very, very capable colleagues in DFO Ocean Science who can put a weather station together, and they put one up in the channel, which is now feeding real-time weather. It's publicly available, so GitGut and Heart Nation and people living in Hartley Bay like to use it for just when they go up and down Granville Channel, but also it's feedback to the modelers, including Environment Climate Change Canada, so they can do better models. But we are also working on an additional project to further improve that model within Granville Channel, because we need a really high resolution model for that to accurately predict where oil could go. It then obviously tells us how wide do we need to think for protection, or how fast things would move, and so forth. So that's a trajectory model is really the foundation for a lot of things we do. Something else fun we're doing is like the seasonal sensitivity analysis, because, and this is just a small section of it, but because we likely the oil is not going to get pumped for the next few months. I mean, an operation like December, January will be just mad. We're planning kind of further out, so we did kind of on a bi-monthly basis, whole bunch of species. We assess how likely they are to get like a little bit, a bit, or a lot impacted by oil. Well, these are the different colors you see, and this is just a small part of that analysis. And we are doing it. Environment Climate Change Canada is doing it. Nations are doing it. We did it for fisheries. So we try to kind of pre-plan, if something happens in February, March, herring would be a big concern, or you see rockfish come shallow for spawning or other things. Versus, in June, July, it might be a different set of concerns. So we try to pre-plan that we don't have to scramble around last minute in case something happens. And there's also the thing, and that happened in the past, where it guides kind of a little bit, if possible, well, do we want to do the cleanup? Do we want to do the pumping work in the middle of spring when everything having babies, or do we wait a little bit later when the babies are a little older and gone? So can use that kind of operation for a couple of things. Then other things, and this is not strictly, we did that at Bly Island, but it's another tool we want to develop is drones. Drones have been proven incredibly useful for oil spill, just for monitoring and looking for oil. We're also trying to use them for shoreline mapping of oil, because in Bly Island and Sound we have a kilometer of shoreline which has patches of oil. You see, it's not super visible, but this is kind of the smear of bunker C from another old wreck. And you can tell it close up because it has pine needles in it, so it's an easy way to separate from the lichen. So we did put targets down and map them and flew the drone, but turns out we took a lot of pictures on that drone, but this is the trying to stitch it together, which was a disaster. So that's why we do these tests. We realized we need to do much more overlap, much more pictures. So we're going to go out again and test it out and to get the protocol going. That's part of what we do, during spills. We identify gaps, and then we try either during the spill or post the spill, develop the protocols to make them better. Another thing we did while we were out there, so we had the Red-8 coming over. We had our drones, obviously not at the same time. We did on-water observation. We had the camera in the tree. This was all in Bly Island area, and kind of compared how good are they at spotting sheen. It was amazing how there wasn't big sheens, but this kind of 0.5 meter to 1 meter, which on the drone you couldn't miss. From the boat you barely saw, and the plane also didn't really see. On our camera saw it. So it's a good kind of comparison. How do they kind of relate to each other? We also used one of our drones has an infrared camera in it. We thought might be something useful for finding oil, and so this is a oil blob that came up a little while ago. So it's a drop. They come to the surface and they rainbow out, and it just becomes dark gray thing. And this is the visual image, which that's pretty obvious if you've seen it often enough. But then in the infrared, if you see this, you can say, yeah, there's something. But if you wouldn't have that picture, it would be pretty useless. So that particular one, and we dug further down, it's more for agricultural infrared, so plant health, and for oil is pretty useless. But again, we want to test it out, see if it works. Now we know it's not worth spending a lot of time on it. So kind of coming back to Granville Channel and the Selinsky, and this is a picture from the Granville operation 2018, where I was at. That was the pumping operation at the time, but there was shoreline protection Granville Channel over the summer, just to areas we identified together with GitGat. They have been taken out now just because it was winter. They just would get shredded, but they are staged in those areas, so it's very easy. If you have boom staged at the site where it's going to be deployed, it's much easier to deploy and much quicker than if you have it in a depot. So it's available there. We obviously do the ongoing camera monitoring. GitGat is also flying the drone on and off depending on weather. And Canadian Coast Guard, who is the lead in that case because it's a Government of Canada response, there's no polluter anymore, is working on identifying the most suitable kind of oil removal containment option at the wreck to deal with it, hopefully once and for all. And then just kind of my summary slide. So I think the one thing why I really enjoy this work, obviously spills are never happy stories, but what makes it really interesting is that collaboration, which is really in-depth collaboration with all levels of government, the nations, and industry as well. And there is a lot of opportunity for research and development. If you're really in the nitty-gritty of a spill and you keep your eyes open, you recognize there's a bunch of options for research and development to make things better and more effective next time, which is really what keeps me going to work. This idea that we can do better, and that's what we can fiddle around and come up with good ideas. And the big one, there's really new technology. That was one of our drone deployments in Granville. Just the drones have been such a game changer around observing oil, satellite cameras, which send real-time data, and you can change the settings from our office here while it's sitting in Granville Channel. It still blows my mind. It's not new technology, I guess, and those kind of things. And we're constantly exploring further options, working closely with Coast Guard and EWC and everybody else. Yeah, and then I just have my last slide with some questions if anybody has some. So That was it. I see something in the
Awesome.
chat.
Thanks so much, Matthias. That was great.
Okay,
I talked to you about this stuff and I still learned so much. So thank you. That was
good.
great. Yeah. I invite anybody who wants to ask questions. You can like raise your hand or just turn on your microphone and camera.
And I can, while we do that, I see there's a question in the chat from Allison.
Sure.
Yes, so this is a very good point around weather conditions and the ability to respond to weather conditions. I'm the last person who say, you know, boom is perfect. We put boom in the water and that's it, and it's safe, because all boom has weather limitation. A lot of the standard boom you see, it doesn't take too much, like half meter, 1 meter waves will overpower it. There's some bigger booms out there, but we don't have a lot on our coast. So yes, there are limitations in a lot of weather situations. Boom will not be effective. On the flip side, the one positive thing is that more storms, bigger waves also break the oil up quicker and make it kind of go away quicker. So that's maybe the one positive thing there. There was an oil spill in 2019 or 20. It was the biggest oil spill in Canadian history, in recent Canadian memory. 25 cubic meters on the East Coast. The reason why nobody heard about it, it happened in a 40-knot gale, and there were 7-meter waves. It blew offshore, and the oil was never seen again because it just got pulverized by the weather. So that's one positive there. And DFO, we don't have contingency plans for that. If it's bad weather, we do what we can. We provide our information, but if it's not safe to go out there, then we just have to watch, unfortunately. So yeah, that's a very good point. How do you get oil out of the, I can just go through the chat question. That's okay, idea, unless you
do you like me like reading them out to you so you have a moment to pause and breathe?
Oh, it's okay. I can read and talk at the same time, you know.
Yes. Oh, you're great. Okay, sure, go for it.
Yeah. So next question: how do you actually get the oil out of the water, and where does it go? That's again a very exciting. That's a very good question. So getting oil out of the water, well, there's a couple of ways. I rephrase it. How does the oil go away? So oil does break down naturally. This is a natural product after all, which takes its time. So in some scenarios, that's the preferable option, but otherwise the way to get it out of the water, you can either use sorbents, so booms and pads, a special material which will not absorb water, but absorbs oil, but you produce a lot of waste. Or use skimmers, which are disc brushes which go through the water and then kind of flick the oil into a pump. Or you have these floating skimmers which are just at the surface. Imagine you put this, you know, when you sit in the bathtub with a kip and you have a water cup and you put it right at the edge, so it just goes over the top. It's kind of that principle, but depending on conditions and oil, there are some challenges. You get a lot of waste, and whatever you produce at the end will have to go in the waste stream. So there are specialized facilities where they can burn that stuff, separate the water from the oil, do other things with it, but that's also outside, a little bit outside my expertise, the waste, but that's the waste management side. So that's why I'm saying it's very important, because also if you like boom, if you have pumps which suck the oil off the water surface, those skimmers absorb a lot of water, and if you're in a remote area, you fill up your storage tanks very quickly, and then what do you do? So that's where it's really important to know what to do with your waste and everything else. Okay, where are we? Next one is the one.
Sorry, I added something to the chat, but it's not for you.
No, it's okay. Eric, question from Eric. As an environmental consultant with experience in small scale spill response, how could I become involved in this work? I guess if you have relationships with any of the other partners, I mean, DFO, we kind of, I mean, we sometimes stuff gets contracted out, but from our side, but that's rare, especially during COVID, we did some of that. But otherwise, if you work with nations or harbor authorities or other places, they often use contractors during spills with that expertise to bring into a spill and represent them or advise them or to work for them. So that's what I could say there.
Skip mine. And then there's another one at the bottom. Yeah. I'm happy to read it out if you need, but no, it's okay. You can too. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Great to hear that someone was involved in the first Zelensky. I was involved in the third Zelensky. And I should mention, actually, interesting enough, the Zelensky is only about 20 kilometers away from the Queen of the North. So if you keep Granville Channel straight, there's Gill Island where the Queen of the North is. And at the last operation we did work on the camera in Zelensky. We needed to upgrade, but then we flew a drone over the Queen of the North and we did see diesel sheening and smelted. So it's another one on our list. But it's obviously it's going to be a difficult one as well. It's deeper, but it's newer, which is this deeper is harder, newer is better because it's less crumbly. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just curious about the concept of incidents waiting to happen, like abandoned small vessels that are very common. And we know that at some point they will turn into a leak, but they're like, how does that work? Like when, like, it's just interesting to me because mostly they've lost their responsible party or someone's trying to live on it and isn't going to report. So I'm just kind of curious, is there like a pull out package of, we know this might go, can we boom, like have stuff at the ready? Because that seems such a concern in more urban settings, particularly, but just like I live in Victoria and, you know, it's been such an issue, right? And it feels like it's not an incident, but it's an incident that might happen, turn into one anytime, or a spill.
No, I mean, you know, out of the 1,100 spills that get reported, I'm making that number up, so it's a rough estimate, but I would say probably 900 is what you talk about.
Yeah.
Or 800. It's a majority, and what Coast Guard tells you. I guess the one positive thing is there has been new legislation which came in 2 or 3 years ago, and that has been really helping and giving Coast Guard powers, even when it's not strictly just around oil. So they have more powers now and are more able to deal with directing owners who have vessels which are clearly, you know, there's already 2 bilge pumps running, and now they're getting the bucket out. They don't have to watch it sink. They don't have to wait for it to pollute, which was in the past. That when I started, that was, well, unless there's oil, until there's oil in the water, we can't do anything, which is not a very satisfying scenario. So it's better. So there is more work done specifically around those vessels. And they also recently, I think they gave the first fine to someone who basically abandoned their vessel and they washed up on a beach. So they're trying also through fines, kind of get people more motivated. And more of these smaller vessels I see now getting lifted. So sadly enough, when I started and one of these 20-meter pleasure craft things sank somewhere, that was the end of it. But now most of the time, unless it's really deep or whatever, they actually get lifted. So there are more tools, let's put it that way. But there's still some responses where these things suddenly have a lot of fuel on board. And there's also, there are these, they call them response packages. So I think they're like 10-foot containers or 20-foot containers or small ones, which those also are kind of in various places up and down the coast to kind of cover some of that, you know, remoteness of our shoreline. So, and they're set up that the harbor master can pull them out or a nation can pull them out, and there's boom in there and a bit of sorbent and a skimmer, so they can deal with the small stuff or at least contain it long enough until more resources kind of come in. So overall, I think it's better now. And it's getting better, but it's still a resource question. I mean, there's so many of these boats around. I mean, I live in Oak Bay, and just Oak Bay Marina, there are 2 little masts sticking out of the ocean. And yeah. But that's again also where if you see something reported, because once it's reported, it becomes a file and it enters the system. If you see something you get annoyed about, then not necessarily anybody knows about. That's just the one thing I guess I can add. Okay, Phil Lambert, how many wrecks that are leaking do we know of? Okay, that's not an easy question to answer. I mean, someone in Coast Guard did a big project where they tried to they did research around all the the wrecks that we are aware of in Canadian waters, and kind of did a basic risk assessment, how much oil they're likely to have, how much risk they're likely to pose. I would be lying to say that I remember the number for British Columbian waters. It was I don't know. I have a feeling it was below 100. And funny enough, some of the high risk ones are the top 10 is like Queen of the North, Brigadier General Zelensky, MV Shirak, which was Bligh Island, the Coast Trader, which we just visited on a checkup. So yeah, so the worst of the worst are there. And all those are leaking a little bit, like there's droplets. Well, Zelensky right now is more, but we're also monitoring the Shirak. Yeah, so that's kind of the summary, but it's also hard to know. I mean, we don't have our eyes everywhere, but and there are probably wrecks out there we don't know. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but it's best I have. Sorry. Any other questions?
Yeah. Anyone else have anything they want to ask, either through the chat or turning off your camera? I like to think about how wild your days must be, Matthias. Like you
Most of them
go into work and you're like, I could just be doing, because you do a lot of like the prep science, right? And the monitoring science, but you also could go in one day and just like, oh no. So one of the fun ones that I know Matthias dealt with was on top of oil spill is like, you know, when containers fall off vessels and what that day must have been like. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that was the Zim Kingston was after we finished in July 8 months emergency response for Bligh Island, then we had 1 month break, and then the Zim Kingston happened. That was the point. I thought about taking up drinking actually, because that was a month of stuff. That was a terrible year. It was just at the end of COVID as well. That was not a good summer.
Not good. Yeah. So very cool. Matthias and I have gone out using some of those drop cameras to try and look for some of these containers and the debris that's on the seafloor. So our worlds do overlap, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, that's another talk, but it just was too much to put everything in here. I thought there's two or three little pieces, but
no, I think that was super informative, and the animals still made it in there. I mean, look at the charismatic megafauna, but we also heard about clams and all that great stuff. So
you inverts, yeah.
Yeah. And I love the infographic sheets that you all have. Like I can just imagine how helpful that is when, you know, yes, scientists, but also just people who are managing situations just need to know kind of, you know, okay, who's at risk and why, and what does this look like? So yeah, I can imagine those are super helpful.
Yeah, they're like, because in the beginning, I mean, you've seen the original CSAS document for the vulnerability framework. That's not an easy read, you know, 120 pages, and
yeah, no one wants to read that when their heart rate's going like this.
Whipping the infographic out is pretty cool in comparison, for sure. Or just sharing, you know, I can send people the document, but versus, hey, look at those cool pictures. That's just so much more accessible. I think that's a very good way of communicating science. I mean, you work with museum. I don't have to tell you that.
Yeah. Anyway, I don't see any more questions. So if anyone does magically think of something they want to ask Matthias afterwards, please feel free to get a hold of us at the Victorian Natural History Society. We can get you his email, all that fun stuff. And thank you so much for your time, Matthias.
Thanks for the offer to talk. I always appreciate presenting to people outside. That's great.
That's great. Thank you. And everyone else, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and learn more about Marine Night. And next month, feel free to join us online or in person at UVic. Yeah, so thank you again and good night.
Right.